Replicates one that we did for the first Progressive Australia conference in 2011. Now that was the first time ever that a think tank or a political party had really gone out there into the community and surveyed people to ask about what their attitudes were on some pretty fundamental issues. In the last session someone raised what are the values that people want to see Labor and Progressive parties representing, and this survey went a long way to answering some of those questions. Now, of course, right now, this survey and some of its responses are even more important as we're looking at the aftermath of the last election and the sort of agenda that we want to carve out over the next 3 years ahead of the 2016 campaign. It's so important that we have an understanding not only of some of our weaknesses, but also where some of the opportunities are for constructing new progressive agendas and also defending some of the older ones and some of the legacies from the last government as well. So we might just step through the survey. It's very slide rich. You are not going to be underwhelmed with PowerPoint. There is a lot of PowerPoint in this, so get ready for some pie charts. So look, just firstly, it was a survey of 1,000 people conducted by UMR as part of this conference organisation with a high degree of confidence and matched to ABS census data nationally. But we broke the voters into really 5 categories of interest to us. Now you can see here this is an interesting way to segment a voter group, but we broke it into a Labor base, people who voted Labor in the last election and will definitely or probably vote Labor in the next election. These are people who are Labor. These are our people. Soft Labor voters, people who voted Labor in the last election, but who are not definitely or probably voting Labor at the next election. So people who are definitely there in the Labor column right now, but have some doubts about Labor. We then have soft coalition voters. These are people who voted coalition in the last election, but these are people who we're really interested in winning back. We want to hold our soft Labor voters and win some coalition soft voters as well. Of course, we spoke in the last session about the Greens political party, people who maybe in the past have voted Labor, but who in the last election maybe voted for the Greens. A lot of these people are definitely in reach of Labor and can be won to a majority progressive perspective, as are others. We talked about anti-politics and the rise of some of the small parties, Palmer in Queensland, of course some of the micro parties that we've seen around the other states and territories. So they're the voter categories that we're interested in looking at through this survey, and from it you'll see that there's some difference in the voter groups and their attitudes to things, but you'll also hopefully see that emerging from it there are reasons to be at least optimistic. Optimistic about 2 things. Optimistic about the constraints that are imposed on a Liberal government, a Tony Abbott government right now. There are real community limitations to what he can do and not suffer electoral consequences for it. But also there are real opportunities for what Labor can do in constructing an agenda that's true to our Labor values, but actually takes it further as well. So some interesting first up questions that we covered. Political orientation. Now I put this slide up because of course in rooms like this at a Progressive Australia conference, wouldn't it be great if everyone was progressive? I'd love to see that big 50% grey chunk there was the number of progressive people in Australia. But in terms of people who identify as left, you can see it's barely 24% of the population. Of course, those people who are willing to admit that they identify on the right of the political spectrum is smaller at only 11%. But the vast bulk of political people don't adhere to an ideological spectrum position anymore. Those days of politics are over. We are in the world of issues and values-based politics much more. So an interesting first slide. Second slide, the national mood. Now this one's a little bit depressing for people, but it's important to have a reality check in any sort of process like this. You can see that on a classic polling measure of is the country headed in the right direction or the wrong direction, where the dotted line represents the last federal election, the national mood has become more positive and optimistic since the election. A lot of those factors that were dragging down people that we heard about in the last panel, some people have got a sense of optimism about where the country is going now. So first up, obviously we have a very big challenge to turn that sentiment around to make people more critically aware of the problems that they're going to face under an Abbott government. But we asked people an open-ended question as part of this survey, which starts to take us into identifying the landscape that we face as a progressive movement. Open-ended questions are important in research because too often you can ask people an A, B or C question and not actually hear their real view. It's also why we do focus groups, so that people get an opportunity to articulate their views themselves rather than have them set to them by pollsters. And look, you can see these issues here as we list them. Cost of living is a very, very big one. The health system, jobs, unemployment, education, cost of housing, and then you get into some problem areas really for Labor: immigration, asylum seekers, management of the economy, interest rates, and further down, government debt and taxation. But you can see even in that issues list, I mean, it's not something really for Labor people to be despondent about on the first blush. These are all areas where Labor has a record, Labor has an agenda, Labor has policies and views that we can articulate in all those areas. We have a good record on cost of living, particularly the low interest rates that this government inherits from Labor. We have invested heavily in the health system, and we're the party that created Medicare. Jobs, unemployment and education, all strong agendas for Labor. So already, only less than a month after the end of the election when this survey was done, you can see already that there's reasons to at least be slightly cheerful. Across our target groups, you can see cost of living dominates, followed by the health system, with the exception of reachable greens, where the environment and climate change make an appearance, and with unreachable vows, where further down those managing the economy issues come through. Definitely the top of mind issues that we face. Now, this is really the meat of the survey, these questions, and for me they tell a very good story for Labor and for what we can do over the next 3 years. Now, I like to talk about what is an inherent social democratic majority in Australia. This isn't a conservative place. This isn't the United States, a land of small taxation and small government. This is a place where people value community, they value the fair go, and they value the role of an active government in the provision of services. Now, this survey, as I said, we've mirrored the survey questions from where we were in 2010, and I've got to say the responses are remarkably similar over the 3-year period. So despite the real losses that we had in the election as a political party, those were political losses. They weren't necessarily changing values from people, which of course is a good story for us because political losses can always be turned around, but those perceptions can be changed. These sorts of long-term values don't change over time. These are the sorts of things that people adhere to and think about when they're evaluating a political project afresh at a next federal election. So in terms of our views on government, you can see here we asked people 3 questions, which is replicated in the other questions. In general, I think government is a force for good. It helps improve my life and that of my family. It's normally part of the solution, not part of the problem. Against that, we put in red. In general, I think government gets in the way and makes my life and that of my family harder. Overall, it's part of the problem, not the solution. And then we put a softer message in there as well. In general, government doesn't really seem to have much impact on my life or that of my family. Now, you can see that when we put the what you call traditional right-wing small government argument up against a progressive argument on government, the progressive argument is definitely stronger. Also, in the grey area, there's definitely room for a progressive argument to emerge there as well. More importantly, though, we asked this question. Now, what intrigued me about the response here was when we last asked this, we were still in the middle of the global financial crisis. We had only just really turned the corner. And we asked which of the following is closest to your view on the role of government managing the economy during a global recession. 1, in a global recession, the government should stimulate the economy and jobs, even if it means we go into some debt. Or in a global recession, the government should not stimulate the economy and jobs in order to make sure we come out of it with low debt. Now, you can see there, 34% of the population voted Labor at the last election, but 60% of these survey respondents identified with that position. So the idea that we should be passive, defensive, overly unsure of our position on issues like debt and job creation and stimulating the economy, false. And you can see even there with coalition soft voters, a net positive approval of 28, so overwhelmingly more reach with those voters. Moving on, we talked about the role of government in regulating business. This one more divided, where we asked the question, on balance, the freedom for business to make a profit serves the interests of society as a whole, so there should be minimal government regulation in the market. On balance, the freedom for business to make a profit often serves the interests of a minority in society, so government must intervene to prevent the market excesses. Evenly split on first blush, but you can see we do have a problem there on some of the questions around government intervention with the coalition soft and Labor soft groups. much more persuasive with some of those people in the reachable others. As we were talking in the last session, people who have been disenfranchised, locked out of the economy, they see government as a potential way to help in that situation. Now, we asked the question, which of the following is closest to your view on government investments in infrastructure? One, it's more important for the government to improve Australia's healthcare, schools and transport infrastructure than it is to cut taxes. Cutting taxes is more important than investing in better schools, healthcare and transport infrastructure. I think we can definitively say that the era of low taxation policies from Labor should be over. It is over, thankfully. But this chart should be significant in pointing out that people do want to see solid investment in social infrastructure. Now, when we start to talk about the job losses, the cuts to the public sector that we know Abbott wants to put in place, not just the ones he announced, but the ones that will come out of his Cuts Commission, we can see the sorts of political problems that an Abbott government will run into if they don't prosecute a winning political debate in that area. And you can see there with coalition soft voters, overwhelming approval, obviously, as with the other voter groups. Healthcare, a choice between governments should maintain a top quality public healthcare system or governments should encourage greater use of the private system and more user pays. Overwhelming support for a public health system. So not just Medicare, but also don't forget we've got a government that has committed to privatise Medibank Private, the first step potentially in a more user pays health system. So in this sort of area, as we mentioned in the last panel from some of the further quantitative research we've done, health is definitely a potent area for Labor to continue to advocate on. Now, workplace relations. This one is critical and this should be reassuring for a lot of people. But it also should be a dose of reality as well. I mean, is a first-term Abbott government going to try and reintroduce work choices? I would suggest that they wouldn't. I would suggest that they would see that as political folly. And this slide, in many ways, indicates some of the nuance there, why they wouldn't go for that, but why they will look at other areas to try and undermine workplace conditions, primarily by targeting the union movement, which I'll come back to. But the choice of questions there was governments should be actively involved in workplace relations to make sure all workers have fair pay and conditions, versus governments should leave it up to employers. Overwhelming response there. And across all the voter groups, again, the coalition soft group there, prominent. Yet again, those disenfranchised, reachable others, also strong. So on that sort of ground, you can see that there's a strong social democratic majority emerging out of what you would call traditional Labor areas: health, education, investment in infrastructure, intervention in the economy, support for an enabling state and workplace relations. So reasons for hope. Now the next slide is interesting because it was an area of change from the 2011 survey that we did. Now this is views on climate change, an issue many of us are passionate about. We asked people to choose between climate change poses a real risk to Australia and the government should act to significantly reduce the amount of carbon pollution versus the risks of climate change are exaggerated and government should only take steps that don't hurt business and households. Now, a majority support for action on climate change, a good first position. But when you look at the breakdown and that coalition soft number, whilst there is still strong support amongst that group for action on climate change, what this slide tells us is that debate is more polarised than it was, is more broken down into partisan politics than it was in 2011. So you can see how the Liberal Party, through their irresponsible actions over the last 3 years, have changed some of that debate in the community. We have more work to do on climate change. And this one is a very disappointing slide, unfortunately, which is the following is closest to your views about Indigenous issues. The government should put more resources into Indigenous programs that are designed to increase life expectancy versus there's already enough resources being put into programs for Indigenous people, and providing any more will just make Indigenous people more dependent on government support. Unfortunately, a majority there, including with soft Labor voters, strongly with coalition soft voters and reachable others, against that proposition, which means on an issue that is so critical for Australia's future, reconciling with our Indigenous past and present, we have so much work to do. Now, this is really where things do get a little bit interesting for us. If you like, those were some of the signs of hope. We've got in that solid social democratic majority where a Labor opposition can carve out an agenda over the next 3 years. But this is where some murkiness really comes into the survey results. And you'll see as I quickly go through a couple of these slides that on areas that are really much more about personal responsibility, for the left, for progressives to carve out an agenda there, we really have to be talking to people not only about what the role of government is, but also about individual responsibility and mutualism and cooperation as a part of our agenda. It's not going to just be answers that involve government action. So on this question, we asked who has the most responsibility for its citizens. It's the government's responsibility. Government should be there for people, a more moderate position, or too much help from government undermines people's responsibility to look after themselves. So you can see there's stronger support, I guess, for the more moderate middle position rather than what would be the traditional centre-left position. Now, just quickly in terms of those agendas as well, I've only got a couple more slides because we're running right up against time, I think, and we want to do a few questions. We asked this question again in this survey, which I think is an interesting one. We asked people what they thought about the last 20 years and how life's changed for ordinary Australians on the basis of material wealth, physical well-being, overall happiness and emotional well-being. And I think the results really say something interesting for missed agendas for the left. I think there are many opportunities for us here to be talking about a whole range of agendas. Some of them will be picked up in panels tomorrow around the limitations of action by government. But if you look at on material wealth, people obviously agree that Australia is a more prosperous place now than it was 20 years ago. 44% believe that material wealth has increased versus only 21% who believe it's decreased. But when it comes to things like physical well-being, overall happiness and emotional well-being, people don't feel that their quality of life has improved. So people are feeling more wealthy, they have more disposable income, but in terms of their physical well-being and overall happiness, they're certainly not feeling it. And some of this is reflected in those more traditional issues that we see, like cost of living pressures coming through the system. But also I think there are other agendas there that perhaps progressives can pick up into the future. Now, importantly, same-sex marriage, marriage equality. Marriage should be allowed between people of the same sex or of different sexes, or marriage should only be between a man and a woman. Majority support for that proposition. But you can see, again, strong opposition from the Liberal Party has changed views. That question has gone slightly backwards in our survey. There are many surveys on that question out and about that people should have looks at. But on our survey, that question has gone slightly backwards from where we were in 2011. Now, I might actually skip through these ones so that we can do some more Q&A. I really want to finish on one final question because it's important for understanding elements of the fight back that we need to make over the next 3 years. Now, this question we've seen, again, a change from 2011. It's to do with the role of trade unions. We asked 3 responses. Trade unions are essential to preventing the interests of big business and bad management trampling over those of workers. Trade unions have an important role to play in bringing people together to improve conditions at work and to help employees when they need it. Or trade unions are a relic of an industrial age that is now long gone. They just get in the way of an efficient economy and individual workers solving their own problems. So the good news in that is 18% plus 43% gives you a majority support for trade unions having an important role in Australian society. The Liberal Party's anti-union rhetoric really is appealing to their narrowest base. It doesn't really break into their softer voters or soft Labor voters in the same way. But in terms of comparisons with 2011, what we have seen is a shrinking of the blue segment of the pie chart. Trade unions are essential to preventing the interests of big business and bad management trampling over those of workers. Now, I mean, this is concerning. Trade unions are going to be critical in resisting campaigns like privatisation, workers' compensation that Jackie Trad mentioned in Queensland, a whole range of issues. Unions as important social actors are going to be at the forefront of those campaigns, but what we have seen is a decline in support for trade unions on that first measure. Probably a result of some of the things that we've seen in the media over the last 3 years and an aggressive Liberal Party as well. So just to sum up, this survey is going to be made available online. It'll be on the Progressive Australia webpage, including some of the slides that I haven't had time to go through today. There's a rich stream in there, which we haven't really covered, which goes more to that individual responsibility, role of government, social responsibility aspect, questions on crime, homelessness and alike. So if you're interested in those areas, there's definitely more for you to go through there. But what I really wanted to do today was to put out there some of those reasons to be cheerful, reasons to be a little bit confident. There is hope that we can build a strong progressive agenda for Labor for the 2016 election. It will have resonance in the community because of those long-term values that people have signed up to over generations now. And also there are real constraints on the Conservatives in what they can do in government. So politics is much more interesting than it might look at the end of an election loss, and there are definitely opportunities for Labor into the future. So we've got about 5 minutes for some questions before people will need to get a sandwich, and I might just hand over the mic.
Hi, my name is Harry Jian, and my question is, out of all this experience, what's the main progressive idea the ALP has to establish to go ahead for the next election?
Yeah. Well, it's really an answer in two parts. The first is negative. The ALP needs to address significant perceptions around economic management and in some senses around debt. You saw from those slides, debt is the lesser part of that, but economic competence is definitely our lead pass for the next election. But on top of that, it is really building a strong agenda for job creation. In a diversified global economy, it's embracing new jobs, but also protecting existing jobs. That's got to be the number one agenda for us. Graham?
How many people took part of the survey?
I was just over 1,000. Any other questions? Oh, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. One of the things that weren't mentioned there is people's the democratisation of Australia. Now, we've just had an election for the Labor Party where the membership voted for candidate X and the caucus voted for candidate Y, and we've been overruled. It's sort of maybe not something we're comfortable with, but we have to move on with it. But I guess what I'd like to, there's sort of like a broader context to all this, and maybe you know a little bit about what I want to say, and I don't know how to say it in 2 seconds. But I think it's one of those things that people feel disempowered, and we need to find ways of empowering them. And you look at the of us and the get-ups of the world sort of thing, putting issues forward. I think some of that's going to be covered in later sessions, so I might be speaking a little bit early on it. Would that be right?
Yeah, no, it's a spot-on question, Peter. And look, in this survey, we didn't ask as many questions as we did in the first. We pared it back. So if I can just hark back to 2011 for a second, we did ask some questions about democratic empowerment and the democratic deficit. And look, people really did feel that they were locked out of major political decision-making. So you're absolutely right. The form and substance discussions about what Australian Labor does as the mainstream progressive party in this country are important. People want to be included in a political process. They're not satisfied, just by the way, by simple involvement in things like get-up or single-issue campaigns. They want a deeper and richer involvement in the political process. And that's where Labor, really does have to change itself and make sure that it's opening itself up to, the people who hold these views, which is certainly much bigger than our growing, but still small 50,000 membership. Just up the back there, or in the middle there.
I just wanted to ask, was this taken after the election?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so mid-October.
It's a snapshot in time, isn't it?
That's right.
One snapshot. And in a month's time, it might be a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say slightly different. What was reassuring in this survey was when we asked the same questions in 2010. Yes, we'd just gone into minority government, but we were still in government. I think politics was probably more favourable to us at that point than it is now. A lot of these questions were almost exactly the same in their responses. So in terms of that social democratic majority that I talked about, it is definitely there. Right now you'd say it's latent because it's been confused by big P politics. What has happened in Parliament, happened in the Labor Party, happened in the news cycle. But in terms of those long-term values, they seem really quite enduring. They're durable, they're there. Just here.
My name's John. Brother, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to cheat. In the previous session, because it rolls into both. The question I was going to ask previously was a little bit about constituencies, and I think you're talking about constituencies here indirectly. Issues like climate change, mentioned. Issues like refugee policy, superficially mentioned. Issues like mining tax, everybody seems to have their head in the sand these days. There have been people who have thought that all of those things were positive and a part of our traditional interest and activity. A lot of water's going to flow under the bridge between now and 2016. But do you think these will have to be washed away as issues, or do you think that we will need to face them and constructively?
Yeah, look, that's a really thoughtful and good question. It's really a question about what is going to change in politics. For the last 3 years, there really doesn't seem to be much difference right now, to be honest, between being in government and being in opposition in terms of the political fight. The debate still seems really pretty much where it was 6 months ago, despite a change in government in terms of what progressives are saying and what conservatives are saying. So I think some of those issues, are still to be debated and resolved by the community. It won't be about an election result here or there, but it'll be about where community sentiment goes. But it is really important that we start talking about new agendas as well. There are some things that are true to the Labor tradition that we need to get back to, but there are also new things that we need to carve out that recognise the rapidly changing environment that is the Australian economy and what we do in particular to create jobs in this Asian century. And that's a new discussion for us. That involves things around not just government, but what we're doing with services industries, financial industries and alike, and engaging with people who are maybe in areas where we haven't spoken before, like young professionals in the inner city. If we're talking about building a constituency for Labor, it's going to be, I think, more diverse than it's ever been before. 2016, it'll probably be one step along there. By 2019, it might look really quite different, but the constituency that elects the next Labor government, whether the next election or the one after, will be very different to any we've seen before. Just over here, Mike.
It's kind of a boring question, but a few of the results indicated on the slide were noted to be a very small sample size. What kind of number were you talking about?
Yeah, so that was primarily the reachable Green voters. So when you think about it, Greens made up around 8% of the voting population. Reachable Greens make up an even smaller percentage of that. So you're thinking about 4% of the sample. And Mike, just behind.
Nick, the previous session, Tony talked about, in his view, the capacity to run the economy as being the price of entry, to be competitive on other issues and values. Your slide showed that it was a mid-range issue around about 18% as opposed to the big ones at 52%. Is there any simple, instant, quick way to reconcile what appear to be two completely incompatible perspectives?
Well, I think you've got to really have a look at... this isn't working anymore. You've got to have a look at the... there we go. You've got to have a look at that issues list, I think, a little more comprehensively than just that single response, Mike. When you have a look at it, there are a range of... There it is. There are a range of issues there that go to economic management. So there's the cost of living question, jobs and unemployment, cost of housing, managing the economy, interest rates, government debt taxation. Now, there are a lot of economic issues in there expressed in different ways by different voters. When you put all of those together, you certainly start to see that there is a picture there of what is of concern to people right now. Industrial relations right down the bottom at 3%. That's the lowest I've seen it for about 10 years. So I think, the picture for us is more complex based on the quant, but what I would also say is that the qualitative research is so important. It would be a mistake for us to simply do the 1960s social scientist and say, look at this wonderful quantitative survey that's from a representative sample, without having a more nuanced understanding of the push and pull of politics, which is what you really see played out through qualitative research. And through that research, we can see in the last election that, yes, we do have an exposure problem around managing the economy. It's something the next Labor government will have to address, the Labor opposition will have to address as well. So that issue will be there for us, and we'll have to respond to it. I think the rest of the survey provides some direction on what to do. The first thing is a steadfast defence of what we did in the global financial crisis. I mean, clearly that was the right decision to make. It was the right decision for Australia. We emerged unscathed, whereas other economies fell. We must continue to prosecute that case and not accept that there is a justification for massive cuts to government expenditure. And we've probably got time for one more question. So we might just go right here in the middle.
Susie, you talked about job creation, and I wondered who the Progressives would see as the future employers.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. We didn't ask it in the survey. I think the way to take that answer in the survey is to recognise that it's a real concern. It's a concern for people in terms of their own employment, the growth of insecure employment. People are feeling less and less secure in their work. But they're also concerned about job opportunities for their children, where the future of the country is heading in a general employment sense. How do we integrate with this Asian century to create secure, high-quality, high-skilled jobs? So I think what we see in the more qualitative research is people really want to see those high-skill, high-wage jobs. So investment in apprenticeships for traditional manufacturing trades important, construction important, but also higher quality white-collar jobs are important as well. And also I spoke about the growth of those more professional industries in the inner cities around TV production, film production, all those sorts of creative industries. I think there's also an area there where some people in this survey would look to that as an opportunity as well. Now, I'm just conscious that people do need to eat because it's a long day, so I'm going to eat as well. So if anyone wants to grab me for a further question or a chat, happy to go into things in more detail. But thanks very much for coming along to the session this morning.